Greetings and welcome to another episode of Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. Let's start it. I'm delighted to welcome Ian Fletcher, member of the advisory board of the Coalition for Prosperous America and former research fellow at the US Business and Industry Council as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Ian is the author of Free Trade Doesn't Work and co-author of the Conservative Case Against Free Trade. Alongside Marc Fasteau, he co-authored IndustrialPolicy for the United States, winning the competition for good jobs and high-value industries published by Cambridge University Press. In this episode, Ian offers thought-provoking insights from his widely acclaimed book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, What Should Replace It and Why. So without further delay, let's welcome Ian Fletcher to the podcast. Ian, it's an
Thanks
honor
for
and
having
privilege to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me on your show, Deepak.
Thank you. Ian, you challenge one of the most deeply entrenched ideas in modern economics, that free trade is always beneficial. What prompted you to write Free Trade Doesn't Work, and what personal or professional experiences shaped your views?
Well, around 2007, when I was looking at how the United States was supposedly doing everything right according to the conventional economic models that we'd all been taught, and yet we seem to be continually losing out to rival economies such as obviously China, but also Japan, South Korea, Germany, and so forth. So I started to look into whether this economic theory was really correct. And what I discovered when I examined it is that it's a very fragile structure intellectually. And as soon as you start asking questions, you discover that it really doesn't have the support that people think it does.
You published this book in 2011. Given how global trade, geopolitics, and US industrial strategy have shifted since then, especially post COVID and amid US China tensions, how do your recommendations hold up to in 2025?
Well, I think obviously that the overall thesis of the book has done pretty well. I think I was ahead of my time. I think I predicted a lot of things that have subsequently happened. I certainly wouldn't say the book was right about everything. I certainly got some things wrong. I cheerfully admit that. I think that's inevitable.
Many argue that free trade leads to lower prices and greater efficiency. Why do you believe these perceived benefits are outweighed by long-term economic harm, particularly for the US?
Well, you got to remember that when you say free trade leads to lower prices, that itself is somewhat questionable because if you turn the clock back to, say, the 1950s or even before World War II, when international trade was a very small part of the US economy, you just didn't have a lot of trade. We had the highest real living standard in the world, which meant that relative to wages, we had the world's lowest prices. So the other thing you got to remember is when you look at low prices today, there are always hidden costs. For example, when you have too many imports, you lose jobs in the short run, you lose industrial capabilities. For example, the United States doesn't have the ability to manufacture flat panel television screens. It's a very high-tech item. There's really no excuse for that. And the other thing is when you run a chronic trade deficit, you have ever increasing indebtedness to foreign nations. A lot of people don't realize that the US is the world's most heavily indebted country now.
You claim the economics that support free trade is flawed. Can you unpack what you mean by that and what kind of economic thinking we should adopt instead?
Well, the core of the theoretical case for free trade is something called the theory of comparative advantage, which was invented by a British economist named David Ricardo in the early 19th century. And it was a description of a world that's very different from the world we live in 200 years later. Now, I can unpick the problems with that theory in terms of it doesn't allow for the mobility of capital. It doesn't allow for the fact that trade with a foreign nation will change the industrial structure of your country, what capabilities you have, and they don't. And it certainly doesn't allow for things like environmental externalities where trade can cause environmental harm. But what I would tell you is even more important than picking apart the theoretical flaws of that construct, which you can certainly do, is to look at economic history. because economic theory can be difficult to unscramble if you haven't been trained in it. But economic history is much easier for ordinary people and for business people whose experiences are practical to understand. And if you look at economic history, you see that those nations that developed themselves and became rich in the past, starting with Great Britain, also Germany and Japan, even the United States itself, succeeded under tariff-protected economic policies. So this claim that you got to have free trade all the time, 100%, in order to get rich as a country, that does not stand up very well to the facts of history above all.
Some critics might say protectionism leads to inefficiency and stagnation. What would you say to those who fear a return to tariffs or industrial policy will isolate the US or slow innovation?
It's entirely possible that that can happen if you don't have strong domestic competition. If you look at countries where they've closed off or put up trade barriers and then allowed a cozy relationship between local industrialists and the state to suppress competition, yes, you get exactly the result you're describing. But if you have fierce domestic competition between, say, I believe, for example, that India has a successful automotive sector, partly because you have multiple players in the automotive space and you have fierce domestic competition, which forces people to be efficient and to offer good prices and to engage in continual innovation. So that's really the answer.
In your book, you propose an alternative trade and industrial policies tailored to the national interest. What would a sound US trade policy actually look like in practice today?
Well, it took us nearly 60 years to get into the mess that we're in. So getting out of that mess was never going to be easy. And the process that Mr. Trump is engaging in right now to try and restore our trade situation, it is itself a very clumsy undertaking with a lot of false starts, certain mistakes, but I'm glad he's doing it. And I think that above all, the thing that needs to happen that Mr. Trump has not done or has not yet done is to do something about the overvalued dollar. Because you see, nobody's talking about that. The dollar is overpriced with respect to other foreign currencies, but that's immensely important. It is, in fact, more important than all this tariff business that gets all the attention. So that's the number one thing you actually have to do.
You write that this isn't just an economic issue, but one that cuts across political ideologies. How does your argument appeal to both conservatives and progressives?
Well, the basic fact is that if the United States is going to open its economy to free trade, as it has done, nobody in the United States is going to be able to determine the shape of the American economy with accord to American values and American political priorities as reflected in national elections. So if you have free trade, frankly, both liberals and conservatives, they both lose, which is why it's a winning move for both of them to get some strategic handle on America's trade situation. And then, of course, you can settle disputes within that if you want to vote Democrat or Republican. But the book has supporters on both sides, for sure.
The United States has seen growing trade deficit and deindustrialization for decades. In your view, how much of this directly attributable to free trade agreements and what is the evidence?
Well, the first thing I'd like to tell you is that free trade agreements, these treaties that are signed, they get a lot of attention and they're not without importance, but they're not the fundamental thing because a lot of countries sign free trade agreements and then they don't respect what they have signed. I mean, China hasn't respected the agreements it's signed with us or with India for that matter. Countries like Japan are very polite about weaseling out of their obligations. Even the Europeans are exquisitely polite and politically correct countries like Germany, but they basically run their trade situation the way they want to. And it's only countries like the US and the UK that actually believe in this nonsense that have some very large degree of actually observing free trade agreements. So trade agreements are not really the fulcrum, but free trade overall, which includes a lot of things like, do you allow your currency to float or do you manage its value strategically? Well, the US allowed its currency to get buffeted around on international economic currents and overvalued. Do you open your domestic market? Because you can have free trade at the border all you like, but if you can't distribute your products inside a country, that's pretty meaningless. And the US did all those things, and those things are absolutely very responsible for the deindustrialization of the United States. I don't think that's controversial even among my opponents.
What lessons can be drawn from countries like China, Japan, or South Korea, which have strategically managed trade to strengthen their domestic industries?
Are you talking about lessons for the United States or for India?
Yeah, China, Japan, South Korea, or US and India both.
Well, interestingly, despite the US and India being very different economies overall, we both have a problem of not having a good handle on our trade situation. And interestingly enough, because both the US and India are democratic and don't have the kind of state capacity it would take to impose the very top-down, heavy-handed, intricate technocratic controls that are used to manage the economy in the East Asian countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. There are a lot of things that those countries do that neither the US nor India can aspire to because we're too democratic. But the first lesson is you don't want a laissez-faire policy with respect to trade. Whatever you decide to do, it needs to be a strategic choice, which means that for both countries, tariffs are going to be part of your correct policy model. Managing your currency to the right level is going to be part of your correct policy model, as is state support for the development and distribution of technology. I mean, a lot of technology can be taken care of by the private sector, but a lot of things cannot. For example, the internet was not invented for profit by some company. It was created by government scientists to share data. The great innovations in photovoltaics were not developed by private industry. They were developed by the United States Department of Energy and some other entities overseas. So that's also got to be a part of the picture.
Here, my last question. For listeners who are concerned citizens but not economists, what can they do to engage with or advocate for smarter trader policy, and where should they begin?
Well, I always recommend my own book, but more generically, I recommend that people acquaint themselves with the economic history of their own country and of other successful countries. The real way to understand economics is not to look at the theory like it's some kind of physics, but to look at the history of what have people done in the past in the real world that has worked. That's the real guide to what you should do now. And most of that stuff is not technically beyond the reach of an intelligent person willing to make the effort.
Thank you, Ian, for joining us and sharing your invaluable insights on one of the most pressing issues of our time, the global trade war. Your contributions are deeply valued, and we truly appreciate your time and clarity you brought to these critical conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on your show, Deepak.